I'm going to talk to you about what we call the ACEs study, which means anomalous cognition with electromagnetic shielding. I'm Charles Tart. I'm going to be telling you about the study because I'm the person who knew about the discoveries that led to this in the first place, and the people actually running the study, the ACEs as it were, are Randy Fauver and Richard Knowles, both former students of mine that I can brag about, because you always like it when students turn out well. And you may get to actually see these people in person sometime if you go along. But as I say, I came up with the need to follow up the discovery that this ACEs study is now leading to. So to make this a little more personal rather than just abstract, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and the need for this, and I think you'll find that pretty interesting. As I said, I'm Charles Tart. If I were being conventionally introduced as a speaker at some kind of conference or something, they would talk about the books I've published. That I was a professor at the University of California at Davis and at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And basically, I'm somebody who's been researching for more than half a century on subjects like dreams, hypnosis, altered states of consciousness, meditation, psychedelics, parapsychology, all the really interesting stuff that most psychologists don't want to get anywhere near because it's too wild. But I think it's important and very interesting. And the theme that ties that together for me is that I've been trying to build bridges between the best of science and the best of spirituality. Not third-rate science and third-rate spirituality where they just quarrel with each other and deny each other, but the best of that sort of thing. What led me to get started on that was that when I was young, I was raised to have a conventional religious upbringing. You can see a picture of me on the far right in that left-hand picture, singing in the choir. When I look at the picture on at the expression on my face, I'm a little amazed. I suspect I was blown away by the presence of so many adolescent girls surrounding me like that. But basically, my grandmother took me to Sunday school and church. Grandmothers are the source of unconditional love. If it was good enough for her, it was good enough for me. But of course, I became a teenager and noticed that adults are hypocrites and they're not really living the religion that they claim so much about. And I also got very interested in science, all branches of science, and saw that a lot of what religion claimed to be true didn't make sense in terms of science. I was very lucky in my late teenage years reading so extensively that I discovered that the conflict I was experiencing between science and religion was personal, yes, but it was nothing unique about it. Untold hundreds of thousands or millions of people had gone through a similar conflict in the last century as science became a dominant source in our culture. And some people back in the 1880s had this wonderful idea of why not take the method of science, which is a way of refining knowledge, as opposed to what current scientific ideas of the way reality is at any particular time. Why not take that method and apply it to some of the phenomena that happen in religion and spirituality and see if there was indeed something to it, to start separating out the signal from the noise, as it were. And so I read things like the Journal of Parapsychology, a journal started in, I think, about 1937, about the time I was born, actually, that reported experiments where people could see if people could show something like telepathy, for instance. Well, that's interesting. If one person could read another person's mind, then maybe the idea of prayer is more than just talking to yourself, if messages can travel in ways we don't know about. It got very interesting. The result of that, after 50 years, has been my last book, The End of Materialism, in which I surveyed what's been discovered in parapsychology and applied it to what I know of spirituality, and realized that most people think that science has somehow disproven all religion and spirituality, and it's not the case at all. It hasn't been disproven. It's been ruled out because other ideas about the material nature of the world just ruled out religion, and that's not a scientific conclusion. So what I ended up concluding as I surveyed this was that it's perfectly reasonable to be both spiritual and scientific in your approach to life, and to show lots of discrimination and discernment in both of those areas, because there's a lot of foolishness called science and a lot of foolishness called religion, but there's very real, very important things on both sides of that equation. So how does that lead to the ACEs study? As a teenager, I had my basement laboratory and I was a ham radio operator. And I had my shortwave receiver, a Hallicrafters SX71, beautiful receiver. I could hear shortwave broadcasts from all over the world, and a lot of times there was so much noise, static from electrical storms, from other electrical equipment, and so forth. So it was very hard to understand what people were actually saying on a lot of shortwave broadcasts. I learned in a very practical way about what I later learned as an engineer was called signal-to-noise ratio. The signal's what you want to hear, the information. The noise is anything that makes it hard for you to get that. And in reading a lot about parapsychology and extrasensory perception, I realized that while the experiments had shown that there's something happening there are several forms of extrasensory perception, the signal-to-noise ratio is very poor. That is, most of the time when somebody's trying to use ESP, they're really just guessing. They have ideas about what targets should be or something like that. That's noise. Only once in a while do they actually get the signal. So the signal-to-noise ratio is very bad in terms of ESP. So anything that could improve the signal-to-noise ratio in parapsychology studies, it would make it happen more often instead of guessing, would allow us to really forge ahead in understanding what ESP is, what it meant, and so forth. In terms of signal-to-noise ratio, our ability to control ESP and to understand it was like human ability to understand and control electricity for most of the history of the human race. You had these little static electrical effects. Sometimes if you comb your hair, it crackles a little, and you might be able to pick up a very light object like a feather. Except a lot of days it doesn't work, and it wasn't until recently that we understood why. When the battery was invented, the voltaic pile as it was originally called, and you could get lots of electricity reliably from batteries, our knowledge of electricity zoomed ahead enormously. That's what we need to get to really understand ESP, figure out what it means in terms of spirituality and the like. Okay, I went off to college. I went to MIT thinking I was going to be an electrical engineer. And while there, I also was exposed to Boston culture at a place called the Exeter Street Theater. A couple of ladies owned that who were very interested in parapsychology and spirituality, and they often had lecturers in who included prominent parapsychologists talking about parapsychology. So I got to know these people. And I saw once again that the signal-to-noise ratio was so bad in parapsychology. Yes, you could do experiments, they would be statistically significant. It showed there was ESP sometimes, but it was little bitty, unreliable kind of stuff. One of the lecturers who came was a man named Andrija Puharich, a medical doctor, who thought he had found a way to affect the electromagnetic environment around people that could increase their ESP under some circumstances or shield it under other circumstances. Well, if that was true, that was really important. So I got a summer job in 1957 at the research foundation Dr. Puharich set up. It was called the Round Table Foundation. It was in an old mansion on the coast of Maine. In an old mansion, not because there was lots of money available for ESP, but because the taxes on it for ordinary people were just prohibitive, even if you were rich, but nonprofit foundations didn't pay any taxes. So they managed to use this place for a couple of years before they ran out of money on that research. Um, Puharich thought he had been able to amplify or shield ESP this way, but pretty much nobody in parapsychology but me paid any attention to it. Partly, oh, there's a picture of me the summer I worked up there and of Andrea Puharich. Partly it was because Puharich got too wild in some of his stuff after that. He started working with the Israeli psychic Uri Geller, who was probably a pretty good psychic, but most people thought he was just a magician, fooling people. So maybe Puharich was being fooled too. He wrote some papers on it, but people in parapsychology didn't think much of Puharich. So nobody really followed up this fact that he may have found a way to really increase or shield ESP. Well, in terms of increasing the signal-noise ratio, a really important lead was being lost. Puharich found something called a Faraday cage could affect people's ESP. This is a picture of a very fancy Faraday cage. You can only see a little of it, but the lady you see sitting at the back was one of the world's greatest spiritualist mediums, Eileen J. Garrett. She was a fascinating lady. I met her a few times. She was one of the people who spoke at the Exeter Street Theater. And she would go into a trance and feel that she channeled the spirits of the dead, and sometimes they gave useful information, and sometimes she just tried to do ESP. And she herself was very open-minded, because I remember talking to her granddaughter about Eileen Garrett's own attitude towards spiritualism and ESP, and she said, Eileen Garrett said, on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I think I'm probably doing what it seems to be doing. I'm channeling the spirits of the deceased. And on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I think the psychologists are right, actually. My unconscious mind is making all this stuff up, maybe with a little ESP thrown in to make it sound good. And on Sunday, I try to forget about the whole damn thing. Very, very intelligent lady. Well, she was in a Faraday cage there. The next picture shows you a better picture of it. This is a very fancy Faraday cage, paid for by one of America's most famous inventors, John Hayes Hammond, largely forgotten now. He was one of these people who had hundreds of patents. And he had his own Faraday cage built. I always get caught looking at the background here. This looks like it's in his mansion, which was called Hayes Castle, because he had a lot of money that he earned from his patents, and we don't get to do things that fancy. But I would love to have a setup like that and have my assistants roll the Faraday cage into the grand hall for when we needed to do experiments, but it doesn't work like that. So what's a Faraday cage? Michael Faraday was a famous earlier physicist, 1791 to 1867. And what he discovered was that if you made a solid metal box, or you could even use metal screen if it was spaced closely together, you would get something like this, okay? I'm drawing here basically a 6 foot by 6 foot by 6 foot cube, and the outside boundary of it, which I've shown in yellow there, is thin sheet copper, all soldered together at the joints, held together with a plywood structure inside. And the whole thing sits on some glass blocks, so it's electrically isolated from ground. But then you can control what the electrical conditions on that Faraday cage are. Why would you want to do that? What's interesting about that? Well, the interesting thing about a Faraday cage is that it makes use of the fact that electricity is basically a flow of electrons, and electrons are all negatively charged, and they repel each other. Just like the same poles of a magnet repel each other, like charges repel each other. So when you add electrons to this metal cage, like by combing your hair or fancier methods, they run onto the metal surface, and they all spread out to get as far as possible from each other to minimize the need to repel each other. I shouldn't say need, I'm anthropomorphizing. But anyway, so what a Faraday cage does is shield you from electrical effects on the outside, from static electrical effects like that, or from radio waves or something like that, and it's very interesting. Here's an example of a Faraday cage made with a rather large wire mesh kind of scene. And the guy standing inside of it is being bombarded on the cage with several million volts of electricity, and he doesn't feel a thing. One of the morals you can take from this: if you're caught in your car in a lightning storm, don't get out while the lightning is striking. Stay inside your car. It'll act as a fairly good Faraday cage, and if your car gets hit by lightning, the electricity will pretty much stay on the outside and then zap the ground rather than come inside to get you. They say it works on airplanes too, but still, I don't know what it does to the instruments of that. But don't do this experiment at home. Okay, so Faraday cage is very interesting that way, and there are lots of ways to build it. Okay, I wanted to test whether I could replicate Puharich's work and find out exactly how it operated in something like that. So when I became a professor at the University of California at Davis, I used some grant money I had to build a Faraday cage, a little bit bigger than Puharich's, but basically all solid copper on the outside, mounted on a couple of, here I am 30 years later, but I was using my Faraday cage at that time to measure brain waves and do sleep studies and the like. Nowhere near as exciting as bouncing lightning off it, but I had a Faraday cage. And my Faraday cage was basically an 8-foot cube, and again with copper sheet on the outside. I mounted it on rubber tires for insulation, and then I could control the electrical conditions of that sort of thing. Well, what did I do? I set up a telepathy. Oh, there's a picture of it. Okay, I couldn't get a good way back picture because it basically filled the whole room that it was in. It wasn't much bigger than that 8-foot cube, and you can see it sitting on its tires there. Fabulous mileage on the tires in this kind of usage. I did telepathy experiments using that Faraday cage with a variety of electrical conditions, and my students in one of my experimental psychology classes acted both as senders, or agents as we technically call them, and as percipients, as receivers to the telepathy test. We set up a thing where the experimenter or agent was in one room with a set of targets to try to send telepathically. That's the stick figure in the lab coat is the experimenter there. And in the Faraday cage in the other room across the hall was the receiver, who had to arrange his or her set of targets to match those of the agent. Now, at that time, students were really interested in tarot cards. That was the mystical rage of the time. So we set up a thing with 10 tarot cards in little plastic boxes, and the agents would consult a random number table to randomize the order of their circle, and then the receiver's agent, no, I got the terminology backwards. The receiver, percipient, would try to arrange his boxes in the same way. There's an example of someone acting as the receiver. This is a difficult task as a telepathy task. By chance alone, you're going to get 0 or 1 each time you do this. You know, in the long term, the average will come out near 1. So when you do get a hit, you're kind of impressed by it because you know it's not likely to have happened just by guessing. Well, without going into technical details, it worked. My UC Davis students, acting as receivers and senders, significantly scored, and the electrical conditions of the Faraday cage made a difference in how well they scored. I was thrilled. We were taking a step toward the battery. Now, what was the difference between what I did and Puharich's initial discovery? 2 big differences. Puharich's work was done with what we might call psychic stars. These were people who'd been pre-selected to be able to show significant ESP under ordinary circumstances. So he had a big boost of people going into the experiment. I've shown them with lots of batteries beside them there. I was using the students who were in my experimental psychology class, 1 battery students, shall I call them, something like that, which is very interesting because if the effect could happen with ordinary people, That was even more interesting than if you had to have psychic stars in order to do this. The second big difference was Puharich's percipients were not blind to the electrical conditions most of the time. They knew what the changes that were being investigated were, whereas both the experimenters and the percipients in my study were blind as to conditions. Now, why is that important? One of the things they tell you about in most introductory psychology courses is the Hawthorne effect. Long ago, I'm beginning to forget now how long ago it was, but I think around the beginning of the 20th century, at the Hawthorne Electric Company, they wondered if they could increase their output by giving the workers better lights to work under. So they put in some brighter lights. And sure enough, they got more output from the workers. Now, if you look at the size of that factory, that was quite an investment to put in brighter lights all the way down there. But of course, greed comes in, and if giving them brighter lights will produce more output, maybe even brighter lights will produce more output. So they spent some more money again and produced even brighter lights, and the workers produced more of the electrical stuff that the Hawthorne Company manufactured. And they tried it once more, and it worked again. And then some wag said, "Wonder what would happen if we dimmed the lights a little." So they dimmed the lights and the workers' output went up. And they dimmed them again and the workers' output went up. And what they finally realized was that it wasn't the amount of light per se that was affecting the workers. It was the fact that changing the lights showed them management is interested in us. And that improved their morale and they worked better. Okay, this has since turned into a recognition that in all sorts of psychological experiments, you can bias people that things ought to come out a certain way, and that'll probably make a difference, but you're not really learning anything about the basic process. You're just learning that people influence each other. We don't want to do that here. That's why my experiment was superior methodologically in that people were blind as to conditions. So this was really in effect due to the electrical conditions, not because somebody expected it to be better or paid attention or something like that. The ACEs study will be like that also. People will be blind as to conditions. There'll be a number of different conditions there, and we're going to learn something about the process itself. For the ACEs study, anomalous cognition with electromagnetic shielding, a question will be, of course, could we get it to work again under somewhat different circumstances? We'll be using a Faraday tent rather than a Faraday cage, because then we can move it to several different places to make it much more convenient to people. The question will be, what's the best tuning of the setup to get both the shielding or the increase kinds of effects? There are several different things that can be done there. And can we get any idea of why it works? How come this, because at first you wonder why. Telepathy is not electromagnetic. Okay, when people first got good evidence for telepathy and then people discovered brainwaves, somebody thought, oh, it's electrical signals in the brain and it's kind of like a mental radio sending it, but it turns out that's not the case. Telepathy doesn't behave like an electromagnetic radio would in any way. But why did it work? That's kind of interesting. So, a lot of interesting and important things could be discovered. Now, I'm deliberately not being real detailed about the electrical conditions alike because I don't want a Hawthorne effect. Neither do the ACEs, Dr. Falver and Dr. Knowles. We want to find out what's actually going on here. So, don't worry about the particular conditions or what our biases at the moment might be, because they could change moment to moment anyway. But if you get involved in the tests, it'll be interesting. You'll help us learn something, and we'll thank you in advance for participating in the ACEs study. Thank you. I didn't say much about the implications of the direction we can go with success in the ACEs study. But I should say something more about that, and there are two major directions that can come out of it. What I might think of as applications and implications. The applications involve the practical use of various kinds of ESP. It's already been demonstrated in the remote viewing research that's gone on for more than a couple of decades that remote viewing, a kind of clairvoyance, getting images of distant places, can be extremely useful. I know one of the world's best remote viewers, for instance, Joe McMoneagle, and he was once asked to view a place in Siberia, and they just gave him a set of coordinates. Now, Siberia, you know, that's one of the biggest places in the world, and it's practically all tundra and nothing. The remote viewer described a strange-looking gantry, a giant crane on two railroad tracks big enough to roll over buildings and whatnot, which later turned out to be what spy satellites had shown there. And the people tasking him, this was a government agency, probably the CIA, before this got too scandalous to do, said, that's great, we know you're zooming in, but we want to know what's inside the buildings. That's what we can't see with a spy satellite. And he drew a series of steel gores, like the rinds if you were unpeeling an orange or something like that, to make a big steel sphere about 60 feet in diameter, and noted that the Russians were having trouble welding these people together properly. He didn't know why, but years later they got a picture. They were creating these big steel gores, and they thought this was to be a particle beam weapon. They would set off a small nuclear explosion inside this steel sphere and channel it all out through a narrow channel to be able to take out a satellite way up there with the energy concentrated in that. Or another example of practical application that way is the spy satellites had picked up a big factory in Siberia near its northern border where the Arctic Ocean comes in, and they had no idea what was being made in this factory, and railroad lines to it. It was obviously some very big project. And they asked a remote viewer to describe what was in there, and he basically told them they're building something that looks like a really giant submarine. In fact, it's 3 times longer than you would ordinarily expect any submarine to be. Well, the agency who was tasking him to do this said, yeah, he's got to be imagining it this time. I mean, in the first place, this factory is not on the water. You don't build boats of any sort that are hundreds of yards from the nearest water. But a year later, they dug a canal connecting the Arctic Ocean to one end of this factory, and the new, I think it's Typhoon class submarines came out, the biggest submarine the world had ever seen by that point. So there can be practical applications. I was a consultant on some of this remote viewing project, and I felt kind of ambivalent about being involved in anything that was being supported by intelligence agencies or the military. And then a friend who was working on it said, you know, almost all wars start because one side thinks they can surprise the other and so have a big advantage. Good intelligence keeps wars from happening, because if you don't have any surprise, you're much less likely to launch an attack. That was interesting. And so, you know, there could be other applications like this. I suspect biological applications will come up. But personally, I'm more interested in the implications. And the implications I touched on very briefly before. Is there any reality to spirituality? We have a dominant philosophy of materialism in a lot of parts of the world today. We think consciousness is nothing but the brain. And if you talk about spirits or God or gods or psychic energies and all that, you're just imagining stuff. The brain is good at imagining stuff. But that's all it is, imagination. If you pray, you're basically talking to yourself. And, if you pray out loud, your prayer will go all the way to the walls of the room where it'll get absorbed and go no further. But once you see telepathy actually happening under laboratory conditions, well, it doesn't say anything about gods who might or might not pay attention to prayers, but you can no longer say that a person's intentions and prayers are only confined to inside their skull, or what they can immediately do with their muscles or their vocal cords or something like that. That's why I've been mainly interested in transpersonal psychology, implications of parapsychology, to show that there's more to a human being than just the physical brain. And that more is the kind of stuff we think of as spiritual. Now, that doesn't mean you should run out and embrace any particular religion. I tend to think of religions as theories based on some occasional observations about interesting things that have happened, more often based on what you were brainwashed into, you better believe it or you'll go to hell when you're a kid. But something real is going on there. If we can begin to separate out, and it ain't going to be easy, what's real about this larger nature of man beyond just our physical capacities versus what is superstition, craziness, and whatnot, I think that's important. And also, as a transpersonal psychologist, I know that the spiritual side of human beings is important. If you don't have some kind of belief that there's some higher principles running the universe, that it's just the crazy mess you see around you, you don't thrive. It's a real problem. And so, of course, the tendency is to grab some religion and defend it as the truth, to make sense of it and not dare to ask any questions. But I think we could gradually develop a more scientifically based spirituality based on what actually happens in reality, and that would be good for us.